There you go.
Nice.
See, it's a nice angle, right?
Yeah.
Oops.
All right. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
What is up, guys? Welcome to the very first episode of Chillin' with the Trinity. I'm your host, Alexis Vela. Some of you guys might know me as Fit Lex Lou. I will link all those socials down below. Today, we're going to do my first episode, and it is going to be about my testimony and my story of coming to Christ. I'm lucky enough to be doing it with What is Truth Barnes, Christian Barnes.
What's up, guys?
Christian, tell us about your podcast.
All right, so my podcast is called What is Truth? I started it about 8 months ago. In today's society, a lot of people don't know what the truth is. And I asked the question, like what Pilate asked Christ, what is truth? And even though the revelation of the truth is right in front of him personified, sometimes truth is right there in front of us, but you have to move all the gray stuff away. So I want, with my podcast with me and Neil, is that we work on discovering the truth in all situations or all circumstances, whether it's, content that comes out of the news or anything that's theology based or philosophically based. The reason for this is to, spread the gospel of the truth, but also to help people get free from any misconceptions they have.
Yeah. And Christian is just so knowledgeable. He was such a good person to just do my testimony with because he could bring in the Bible, and I can't bring in the Bible as well as he can, but he'll bring it in and he will educate you guys as we go through my story. I need to do a disclaimer. This story is not a pretty one. It is filled with addiction, mental illness, abuse. So if there's anyone watching that is sensitive to those things, then turn it off or don't watch it. But if you're willing to watch it, then there you go. Before we start, I'm going to say some ugly stories about my parents. But my parents, I love them so much. I respect them so much. And just like I grew in this story, they have also grown. So these stories, even though they're ugly, they're not who they are at this moment. So I have to clarify that. I love my parents. I honor my parents. The Bible does say to honor your parents.
So tell me let's start with your testimony, Lex, and then let's start from the very beginning. So as you mentioned, you had some issues with your parents. So let's go from the very beginning of your childhood. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. Okay. So I was born in 1999 and my parents were both nurses. Okay. My dad was studying to be a nurse practitioner. My mom was an RN in the ER. So they ended up working a lot. They had two different faiths too. So my mom was Catholic. My dad came from a Baptist family. So we were kind of always going in between Catholic and Baptist. And then my first school when I was in pre-K and kindergarten was a Methodist school. Okay. I don't really know what Methodist is, if I'm going to be completely honest, but
it's a different denomination of the Christian faith. Like just like there's non-denominational Baptist, Calvinistic, Lutheran. They're all Christians, but they all have a different doctrine of how they approach the faith. Okay. Like, for example, Calvinists don't believe in free will. They just believe in determinism. Lutherans believe in a certain amount of free will, but then they also believe in a lot of determinism. Non-denominationals could be like a lot of different aspects, but like in general, like at Abundant, we're non-denominational. And yeah. There's a whole bunch of different circumstances, but at Methodists do believe in free will. Okay. There's just a little difference in their doctrine style.
Okay. Yeah. I was in that, like, growing up, I was very involved, like, in the church because my grandpa, my dad's dad, was a pastor. Okay. And then I went to this Methodist school, and then my mom was very Catholic. Her mom was super Catholic. But you know what? Like, from a young age, I didn't understand the concept. I never understood, like, what I was learning or what Methodist meant, what the difference between Catholic and Baptist was like. So no one ever really explained those things to me. And then on top of that, we would go to church on Sunday, but my parents were huge partiers growing up and they would drink a lot. There was a lot of parties. I mean, they would have big parties every weekend. And I remember some of my earliest memories are like being in huge parties with them and seeing them drink really, really heavily and a bunch of adults around me drinking heavily.
Right. And it shows you right there because like even though they were involved, like they were the Catholic and the Methodist faith and your grandfather was a pastor, they were kind of living hypocritical lives of what they were supposed to be living. Mm-hmm. And instead of like what you were mentioning right now, it reminds me of Proverbs 22:6 that says that if you bring up your child in the word of God and teach him his ways, as he gets older, he will not depart from it. Meaning he becomes a semblance of his life and remembers it. Yeah. But like what you were saying right now is like they didn't bring you up that way. So you weren't able to grow up with it and you didn't get into later, right?
Yeah. And I think, like my grandparents did a really good job because my grandpa was the pastor, so my grandma was always having me in Sunday school and stuff like that. But I think because my parents one foot in, one foot out. You know what I mean? It was like I was also the same. I would be one foot in when my grandma was teaching me Sunday school, but as soon as I went with my parents, it was like that all went out the window.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, they started fighting a lot. It would be like going to my grandparents' house, studying the Bible and always talking about the Bible, and then I would go back to my parents' house and they would just start fighting. And then not only that, like when they were drinking, and you know, like alcohol just enhances the fights, they would fight a lot more. So then that became a norm between not only my parents, but between me and my parents. So now I was not, at a young age, me and my parents were fighting. I was fighting with my mom was fighting with my dad. And it was just this big cycle of fights. Started really, really young.
And then, so you got that from the early age. So what happened after that? Like what continued from there? This is before your sister was born, right?
Yeah. So my sister was born when I was about 5.5. I remember before that, you know, I had gotten kind of the rough end of my parents' fights. And at that point, I had been longing for a sibling because I had felt so alone based off of the fights. And I remember like I would feel tremendous anxiety. I was 5.5 and I had so much anxiety that I would hate to go home anywhere. If we left anywhere, if we left to the movies, if we left to a friend's house, if we left to my grandparents, I would beg my parents to stay there. And I was like, I don't want to go home because home was unsafe for me. So when my sister was born, I was happy. I was like, oh my gosh, okay, there's somebody that's going to go through this with me. But I think as any sibling does, I created a little bit of a resentment for her because I think my parents saw that, you know, they weren't doing such a great job with me. So they kind of try to give a little bit more effort to my sister. And that broke me. That hurt me. And at some point, you know, I stopped seeing her as little sister and I saw her as like, oh, you're getting treated better than me. So I kind of shunned her. Right. Sorry, Erika, if you're watching this, I love you.
So there's two things I want to touch on. So the first thing is like, so you're at 5 years old and you already acknowledge, you know, the idea of like alcoholism, which is crazy because most 5-year-olds, like I have nephews who are like 5-year-old and they don't even know what alcohol even means, right? So there's a sense is like in the psychological field is that when children are around extreme stresses, doesn't necessarily mean violence, but just in general extreme stresses, it causes their body to quickly have to adapt into the situation due to the danger zone. And it's kind of like, it's not the proper maturity, but you mature rapidly because you're trying to survive in the area. The other thing too is that with a sibling, your desire for a sibling wasn't necessarily to have a sibling that you could tell me if I'm wrong, but like that you could love, but someone that you could not be alone with, right? Because if you go home alone, it's worse to be alone, especially when you're in hell, right? Mm-hmm. As long as if you're with someone, then you can handle the situation out. The idea is the sibling jealousy syndrome, right? They could be a perfect family, and then the new sibling gets up, and then the parents give their attention to the new sibling, and then the older sibling gets jealousy towards that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. So that's exactly what I'm thinking. So now it's just like already my self-worth of myself was like at a low point. And then when my sister came and they were like all nice to her and stuff like that, and they weren't yelling at her the way they would yell at me, that's when that self-worth just kind of went low. And then, yeah, I mean, like at some point she got to an age where she could understand what my parents were doing, where they were fighting. They would close the door, but the walls were super thin in my house.
Right, yeah. And even then, even if the walls are thick, kids are very intelligent. Kids are able to pick up when there's strife between parents, especially if you have like very intelligent kids. Now let's switch this around. When you have very intelligent kids that are they have brat attitudes, and they want to gain something, if they're able to get their parents to war with each other to get what they want, they'll manipulate that and take advantage of it. And it shows strong early intelligence. Of course, in the biblical sense, that's like sin, right? Mm. But in the psychological area, it's like advantage because kids will do things in order to survive. It's like it's an instinct to try to continue to get what I want, right?
Yeah.
And love and compassion for kids is very important, especially for the nurturing side. You get that from your mother, but then you get the protection from your father. Mm. But then if your father, who's a protector, is fighting your wife, you're fighting the wife, who's a nurturer, you try to remnify it because then you can't get your nurturing and then you can't get your protection at the same time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's that survival mode. I didn't learn about that until like way later. But yeah, it was definitely like a survival mode. When my sister got to that age and they were fighting, I remember a significant story. My sister came into my room and she was just crying. And at this point, I was totally used to it. So I was just in my room like, they're doing it again. And my sister comes in crying. And at that point, I had to grow up. Like you're saying, all these scenarios where you have to like grow up at a super young age.
Right.
I had to grow up and I sat there and I comforted her. I told her, it's okay. You'll get used to it. They do this all the time.
And that's that's a very tragic statement to even say that, to say you get used to it, right? Because what you're supposed to get used to in a family hold is comfort, love, joy, happiness.
Yeah.
Not getting used to, hey, sometimes it may blow up. You got to watch out if you say this. Hey, at this time of clock, my dad is usually this way. My mom is usually this way. So it's sad stuff. That very phrase is very sad.
Yeah. Yeah. Moving on from this.
What happened next?
So at a super young age, since my parents were always working,
Right.
they were always leaving me kind of home alone. And that's when we only had one computer. This was way back when cell phones didn't have internet still.
How old were you at this time?
I must have been like 7 or 8.
Okay.
And so like I would go on the computer and I'd play all these computer games. But at that time, Google had these ads. I don't know if you remember that, but Google would have these ads on the side, and a lot
Like on
of them,
websites?
yes, like websites, and they would be like, a lot of them were corn.
Oh yeah.
Corn.
Look at
corn.
look at local area people in your area and all this stuff.
Yeah. There you go. So they were corn ads, and then like I would see it, and then I would be like, no, I'm like, I don't know what that is. I'm just gonna like go away from it. But at some point, my curiosity got the best of me. I started looking at it, and then I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop looking at it. So then every time my parents would leave, I started looking at it every time they would leave. And then I would look at it for hours. And you know what? This was on me, but like I didn't know that my housekeeper, the lady who would clean the house, she was usually there when I was by myself.
Okay.
She would see me doing those things, but I didn't think that she was looking. I didn't think it.
Then she never try to stop you? Or do you think she knew that you were looking at those? Like for example, like if I walk by and I look at oh, she's playing games. Do you think she knew that you were looking at corn?
She knew, but I didn't find that out till later, and she never said anything to me.
Oh wow.
So I found the way that I got caught was I did not know that history was a thing on the computer, as most of these stories go.
Right.
But it's just tragic that this is your 7 or 8-year-old daughter that my mom had to find. So my mom caught me, and I felt tremendous shame, just a bunch of shame. And you know what? I do want to touch on this. I thought that I was gay because I was watching nothing but women. Okay. And so because I was watching nothing but women, I thought, oh, well, I must just like women, you know? And then that also became a thing. Now I thought my mom knew that I was gay.
Gay, okay.
Yeah.
So let me touch on that. So there's a couple of interesting things that I wanted to write about that. So one of because you said curiosity. So one of the interesting things, curiosity is a good thing. It could lead us to good things or to sin. So if you go back to the story of Adam and Eve, Eve was with the serpent, right? And then the serpent starts tempting her. But she had a curiosity of why she couldn't eat that fruit. And that curiosity is where the devil was able to tempt in that area. Can I say that sin is curiosity? No. There's something I don't know what it is, and I'm curious about it, right? Mm-hmm. But when I know that it's something potentially bad and I act on it, then I've begun to sin right there. And the other thing too, like a majority of people struggle with corn. And it's surprising how much, like today in the church, I think it's like 80 to like 90% of the church still watches corn. Mm-hmm. And it's because it's a hard addiction to break off from. Actually, there's even studies that believe that corn is a stronger addiction than cocaine and other substance abuses.
They've compared it to heroin. It's like the same as heroin.
Right. And then what makes it worse too is because, for example, in order for me to get heroin, I have to go find a dealer and get it. Versus corn could be anywhere at any time in any place. Mm-hmm. And that's why in the Bible says, 1 Corinthians 6:18 says, flee sexual immorality. For when you sin against every sin you do is outside from the body. But when you sin in sexual immorality, it's to the body.
Yeah.
So it literally degrades your own body. Where you're like, well, how does it degrade my body? Because it changes the neural function of your mind and your attraction type. Yeah. Where you're just focused to the lust and you can't live without it.
Yeah.
And then it also takes away your innocence, both mentally, physically, and emotionally, for sure.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, that stuck with me. Like, it was such a young age that stuck with me. And then even in my older years, like, it became something that I would watch when I was older, you know, like, you start watching something when you're young, but then like you get older and then you start watching more and then you start watching other stuff and then you start dibble-dabbling into like other stuff. Right. And I think so many people can probably relate to this. Maybe not people that have watched so young, but like the way that it corrupts your brain, like I'll never be able to get those images out of my brain.
Right.
Even though I wish I did, you know, it did mess with my innocence. And now like I was a young girl, but I knew of that stuff. Right. And so like, it made me look at the world differently.
Right. There's like, and then the thing too is like it entices you. Like in Proverbs 7:22, King Solomon, he was the most powerful man in the world, but he fell. He lost his kingdom due to his sexual immorality with women. He was considered a Chad in today's standards, right? Like Andrew Tate, where he has all these chicks, right?
Yeah.
But it ruled him. There's another Proverbs that, well, first let me speak on this Proverb. This Proverb says that when he's very descriptive. Her words are alluring like honey. She takes men and she entices them. They follow the path of her life, not knowing that they're being led to the slaughter. They did not realize that following her into this would cost them their lives.
Yeah.
And it does. It robs people of their lives. They could lose their jobs, their friends, their family members, where people could even think, oh man, this guy's a weirdo. What's wrong with him?
Yeah. And, and in turn on that, like, especially with a child, like, you have to be careful with children doing this because it literally created an identity with me where I was like, I'm gay. And now I'm not speaking on everybody's experience and how they feel, but at least for my experience, I truly believed that I was gay.
Yeah, and I want to touch on that too. So another interesting thing too, that could be why you were looking at that type of.
Well, I know why I was looking at just women. I was looking at just women because I was too scared to look at the men's thing because I was so young. I had never seen what a man looked like naked or whatever. So,
but another thing that could tie into this is like, think about it psychologically. So if you're going towards, you needed that nurturing side, so you kind of went more towards the comforting motherly side, right? The masculine side is where you saw the most of the violence from your father's side. So psychologically, you don't want to see men.
I resented it.
Yeah, you resented men, and you went on the other side, right?
Yes.
Because you know that with like, I mean, I'm sure there's other people who probably have issues with their mothers, right? That more so than with their fathers.
Yeah.
But in the circumstances when the father's the issue, it could change your alterations to what you're attracted to.
Yeah, yeah, and like I don't want to speak for most gay women, but a lot that I have met, like there's just a mutual agreement between a lot of gay women that I've known that they hate men or they resent men because of one specific man that did something in their life.
Right.
And so, so we're getting kind of controversial, but
yeah. I mean,
I can speak from experience. That's all I'm saying.
After you got into this, you're already okay. So tell me what happened with the church, and then did you have any issues with the church, and then at home, like going from there?
No, at that point, like my parents had decided that I was just going to be Catholic, and so I went and completed catechism, which is essentially just being able to take communion, a class to be able to take communion.
Okay.
In the Catholic Church.
Right.
So I completed catechism. I was taking communion. But yeah, I mean, like, I was just doing other stuff when I was at home. Church was not a big thing for me. Church was just something essential that I needed to do. Another thing to obey my parents.
Right. Just like another meaningless task.
Yeah.
Just in emotions.
Yeah, exactly. So, after that, I just started developing a lot of stress because I think like I didn't really have an identity. I remember always feeling like I wanted to be something other than what I was. I wanted to dress like a boy at one point. I did not want to dress like a girl. I resented pink. I resented dresses. And my mom was always arguing with me. Like, bless her heart, she just wanted me to be like a little girl.
Right.
But I was corrupted from a young age, and I wanted to act like a boy. Like, I was already trying to exhibit these like over masculine characteristics where I would play football with the kids at school. And I remember one time, we weren't allowed to tackle. That was a thing. Like, when you play football with the boys at school, there was like no tackling. It was just touch football, right? And there I am playing football with the guys and then I got mad because someone intercepted my catch and I tackle him and he breaks his arm. He broke his arm. That's crazy. I got in trouble and I had to go to detention for like the next, I don't know, but I remember I couldn't play at lunch anymore. I had to be in detention. When I was like little things like that.
When I was in middle school, we could have been playing. Even if we were just playing with the guys, we couldn't tackle. Only in practice we could tackle.
Yes.
We're only allowed to do 2-arm touch.
But imagine a girl tackles you and she breaks your arm.
Yeah, that kid's gonna get roasted.
Oh yeah, this is elementary school. So like I can remember like feeling really stressed out because I just felt like I had no identity. My parents were constantly fighting. They would like at that point, me and my mom were constantly fighting. Like. Again, bless her heart, but I think like she was fighting so much with my dad that she needed to take it out on something, and she ended up taking it out on me. So then me and her would butt heads. And this was like every day for years we were fighting. And that not just like little fights like bickering, like genuinely screaming at each other almost every day.
Okay.
And then one day I just got really stressed. I was about 10 years old. I want to say I had just left 4th grade. It was like the summer from 4th grade to 5th grade. And my parents weren't home. And I said, you know what? I'm going to go drink a beer. And that's when I started drinking. Okay. I started drinking when my parents would leave. Anytime that I felt stressed, I was like, well, that's what they do. That's what they do when they're stressed out. So I'm going to go have myself a beer. And at one point, so I learned this later as an alcoholic, and especially if that's in your genetics, that whenever you have your first sips of alcohol, it won't taste like anything, especially if alcohol runs in your family.
That's interesting.
So I remember drinking my first shot of tequila and thinking, this tastes fine. Why does everyone say this tastes nasty?
Yeah.
I drank 17. I was like 11.
17?
Yes. I remember. I only remember this number because I remember counting it.
You didn't go to the hospital for anything like intoxication?
No. I remember I just fell asleep. I fell asleep.
One of my friends, one of my secular friends, he takes one beer and he's tipsy, crazy. So yeah. I could just imagine him taking 17 shots and he's 22. He'd probably die by the 3rd shot.
Oh yeah.
That's crazy.
Well, that's what they say, when alcoholism kind of runs in your family. And I mean, I know that this goes deeper than just with my parents. My parents are also victims of things that they've been through too.
Right.
So that's why, my first instances of drinking was always oh, I could go off if I want to, and I feel fine.
The thing that's interesting too, because you were, when you were talking about how you became more of the masculine trait, I think the reason why you became more of the masculine trait is because you were trying to become the father that you needed in your life, and you couldn't sufficiently fulfill that area. So then when you would butt heads with your mother, is that you were butting the same ways as you modeled after your father without subconsciously doing it. Even though you know your father was wrong, you end up modeling after him. And then the other thing too is with the idea of the substance abuse of drinking, and in the Old Testament, of course in the New Testament, by the new covenant we're redeemed from the curse of the law, right? But in the Old Testament idea, and some theologians argue this today, is that if you're not accepted Christ, then you're probably underneath the old covenant still. Is the idea that there's the sin is generational, right? Generational sin, and the idea of alcohol. In my family side, there's alcohol and corn addiction in my generational, right? Mm-hmm. So that could probably influence. I'm not saying that if you have this in your fatherhood that you're for sure going to be an alcoholic. Yeah, no, it just means that you're going to be more aware of the potentiality of that malevolence in your life, right? Yeah. You just got to be more, coherent against it. You got to be attuned to it.